right, everybody. Now, I'm sure what I'm about to say that none of you are going to believe it, but I'm pretty sure we might actually get through a whole chapter tonight. I heard that.
Yeah.
Chapter 8.
Your version of speed reading?
We'll see.
Took that Evan Woods speed reading.
You know, I haven't heard that advertised on TV in the last 40 or 50
40 years, yeah.
Been a while.
Whatever happened to that?
Apparently, I guess
Evan
that.
Wood speed reading technique? Yeah, remember that? Yeah.
That just means we're all very old.
Alright, chapter 8, verse 1 says, But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark, and God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. Now, when it says that God remembered, doesn't imply that God forgot them, but it's a word in Hebrew that basically, it does translate as remember, but it's a Hebrew phrase that probably more has the meaning that God acknowledged them. And again, not that somehow God forgot, but that it's God focused his attention on, or he is now directing his previous covenant to Noah. So think of it, remember, in that sense. Not that somehow God forgot them, and it's like, oh yeah, we got these people over here in this ark. But it says he remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark, and God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the earth subsided. Now, compare that with the creation account. What was the first thing that happened in Genesis chapter 1 when it says the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep? What is the first thing God did?
Created the waters.
Well, it said, and the Spirit did what?
Moved over the water.
Spirit moved over the water. Now, the same word, I mean the exact same word in Hebrew, means both wind and spirit. So, while I'm sure most translations refer to this, it says God caused a wind to pass over the water, it just as easily could be translated, God caused his Spirit to pass over the water. This is basically an identical concept as to Genesis chapter 1 when it says that God's Spirit moved over the water. Again, wind and spirit are the same word in Hebrew. It said, and the water subsided. And of course, what was the first thing, after God created the heavens and the earth, the first thing that he did as God focused his attention on the earth was to bring forth land. That's exactly what you're seeing here. So water is now subsiding. So verse 2 says, also the fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were closed, and the rain from the sky was restrained. Of course, we know that while Moses may just now be getting around to describing this in chapter 8, this actually occurred at what point?
After 40 days.
After 40 days. Yeah, we know that it stopped raining after 40 days. So then the water receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days, the water decreased. Now, imagine, if you will, and this is going to be one of those visual things. I think it'd be easier if I drew it out rather than trying to describe it. All right. If the surface of the water is here, and the what was land is here, what would happen, or what could cause the water level to now drop where you now have the water level here where dry land is appearing once again.
The seabed drops.
Yeah, the seabed, God would easily cause the seabed to begin sinking. And once the seabed sank, the water level would now naturally begin to lower. And any water that is over here over land, what's it going to do?
Drain off.
It's going to start draining off, and it's going to drain off in massive flows. But now you'll notice this didn't happen overnight. God allowed it to take place over a period of several months. Now, why do you suppose, and again, I realize that God could have miraculously done all of this with simply saying the word. But for whatever reason, this whole process, God has chosen to use natural means. He brought the flood by natural means. What happened? Firmament began, condensed and rained down. Whatever water was underground has now come up. All of this, granted, you can say that there's a miracle behind it and that God caused it to happen. What I'm saying when I say that God used natural means is God didn't speak the word and just suddenly more water just appeared. God didn't create more water. He used what was already there.
Sounds like an earthquake.
But the point here is, in getting to this, is why do you suppose God would have chosen to allow this to take place over a course of several months and not just, okay, we're done, now let's cause the dry land to appear again? Because you remember, when he created the earth to begin with, how many people were on the earth at that point?
None.
Not a bit. No life, no nothing. Not at that point. But here at this point, while all except what's on the ark has now been destroyed, if God is using this ark to save Noah, his family, and whatever animal life that he's got on board, if God had just suddenly the water just dropped, what would have happened to that ark at that point?
Would crash down.
Oh yeah. And would have probably killed Noah, his family, and on there. So God has allowed the water to subside slowly in order to maintain the safety of those that are on that ark.
He gives the fish and everything time to adapt.
And that's another issue, because now you got basically two types of water in the earth: fresh water, salt water. Now, if there's now a worldwide ocean, where's the fresh water?
On top.
Yeah, fresh water and salt water take quite a while to mix. In fact, if it, with a deluge of this sort, you would have actually had a layer of fresh water above the salt water. You'd go through a little bit of, brackish water as it, then got saltier. So, again, God would have used natural means to save saltwater animals down here. Freshwater fish would have survived at shallower depths, but if the water just suddenly just dropped, what would have happened?
Mix the water and then it would have been
Then it churned that water up, and where's all your freshwater fish now?
all mixed in with everything.
Mixed into the salt.
And of those that are over here on the land, flopping around dying. God would have allowed it to, now again, there's going to be massive runoff, but slow enough that the ocean water over here is not getting mixed up, and those freshwater fish that are over here are then being washed back, into areas where, again, they can survive.
It would have settled into lakes and things like that. where
Settled
the fish
into
would have been able
lakes,
to survive
things
then.
of that sort. So God allowed it to happen over a period of time to, again, using natural means to have allowed the life, sea life at this point, to survive it. Verse 4 says, in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. Now, some of the versions of the Bible, I think King James is one of these, will say Mount Ararat. The original Hebrew does not say Mount Ararat. It says mountains, plural, Ararat. It is known for a fact that there is no single Mount Ararat. The Ararat Mountains is a region that today would be probably in northern Turkey, southern Russia. In fact, where a lot of people think they have found, the remnants of Noah's Ark, and nobody knows for sure. If you've ever seen pictures of this, yeah, it's apparent there's something up there, but nobody knows for sure what it is. But whatever they found is actually straddles the border. One side of that region is southern Russia, northern Turkey on the southern side. Does anybody want to take a wild guess why nobody's actually gotten up close and been able to explore that?
Probably politics.
Well, that's half of it, because coming up from the southern side, the area is so steep and rocky, mountain climbers can't get up from the southern side. It's too dangerous. The only safe approach is from the northern side, and that's where the politics come in. The Russians won't let explorers come in there to check it out. But anyway, it said it came to rest. But notice, even though the ark came to rest, it doesn't say anything at all about, the land being exposed at this point. What happens is that the keel of the boat is grounded on the land below. Now, in the dimensions of the ark, how high was the ark from keel to crest?
45 cubic.
Yeah, which is how much?
60 feet, 62 feet.
18 inches, yeah.
So, and you figured, with the aerodynamics of the boat, the water level would have been about a third of the way down. So you're still looking at, even if the keel has gotten caught on, solid ground underneath, you're still looking at the water level being probably 40, 45 feet deep. Still not
near the top of the mountain.
near the top of the mountain. So we're nowhere near being able to get off of that boat yet. They've just come. Now, why do you suppose God would have, arranged it so that the ark has now kind of gotten hung up in, grounded in a mountainous area?
So it wouldn't get washed out to the ocean. When
There
the
you
water
go. While all this water is flowing out, the ark is being held in place. Even just the way all of this happens proves to me that God has orchestrated every last bit of this.
Yeah.
All right. The water decreased steadily until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains became visible. Notice again, doesn't say that they're anywhere near being able to get off of that ark yet. All they can see is off in the distance, in the other mountains in the area, they can see the beginnings, the top of the mountains becoming visible, which says that, proves to them the water's receding, but they can't get off the boat yet because the waters are probably there where the ark is, still underwater. And even if there was any dry land appearing yet, or I should say land, shouldn't use the term dry land. This any land that appears is going to be waterlogged, muddy, and probably not safe to walk on. And also, as far as vegetation, is there going to be any vegetation coming up in that? Not yet. Verse 6. Then it came about at the end of 40 days. Notice we got 40 days again. At the end of 40 days, that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. And remember that very top layer of the ark, it says there was, a 1 cubit space where he'd been instructed to put in some windows. So he opens a window, said, and he sent out a raven, and it flew here and there until the water was dried up from the earth. Now, notice it doesn't tell us whether the raven came back or not. Apparently, Noah was able to see it. Otherwise, you saw that it was flying here and there. But no indication as to whether this raven actually came back. Why a raven? Why would that have been the first thing Noah sent out?
King James says it's a dove.
That's the second thing.
Yeah.
You're looking at verse 8
Oh,
probably.
Okay. Yeah.
Look in verse 7.
Yep.
Why a raven? Why would that have been first?
Pretty smart bird.
I guess
Well,
I never paid attention to the fact there was a raven first. I've
Well,
always
consider
just
this.
thought it was a dove that was sent.
Was a
both
raven
times.
among those animals considered clean or unclean?
Unclean.
It was unclean. So if the raven didn't come back,
Oh well.
yeah, pretty much. Like, oh well, it was an unclean animal to
Yeah,
begin with.
one.
Also, and ravens are all part of the crow family, so whether it was crow, raven, or whatever, there's actually about half a dozen different species of, whether, raven, crow, I think, what is a couple, I can't remember the names of some of the others.
Blackbird.
Yeah, blackbird or whatever. All of them considered unclean, but they all also, other than just being black or whatever, they also have one other thing in common. They're willing to eat carrion. They'll eat whatever they can find.
Right.
You think there was probably some gnashiness floating on that water at this point? So if the raven didn't come back, it wouldn't have been any great loss because A, it's an unclean animal, and two, that raven would have found something to eat out there on the carrion floating in the water. Which may have indicated why it didn't come back. Karen?
You probably already told us, but I can't remember why the raven was considered unclean.
Because of the fact that according to the law of Moses, which again, keep in mind, the law of Moses has not been given yet, but we can see that even back then, God had already told them the types of animals that were considered acceptable and the ones that weren't acceptable for sacrifice. The reason a raven was not considered acceptable for sacrifice, what?
Because it eats carrion.
Because a raven will eat anything.
Not supposed to touch dead animals.
So because
And that's the biggest
stuff,
thing. What's that?
Because it's just like a person touching something that's dead.
Yeah, ravens will eat garbage, and for that reason,
The same reason pigs are unclean.
yeah, because they'll eat anything. By the way, for those of us in here that like catfish, guess what?
This is bottom feeder.
Catfish are bottom feeders.
Yep.
So under the law of Moses, if we were still bound by that, we wouldn't be able to eat any catfish.
Lobster, shrimp, crab.
Yeah, okay, yeah, because all of those are bottom feeders.
Yep.
None of that stuff is clean food.
And all shellfishes are prohibited, right?
Yep, sure enough, because they're all bottom feeders.
Guess you can't have that no more.
Of course, I don't know about you, but I've met a few people that I think were bottom feeders. All right, enough of that.
Did not go there, did you?
All right, verse 8.
All right, verse 8. Then, now comes to the dove. Again, we don't know whether the raven came back or not. The Bible, it just doesn't tell us. My guess is probably not. But verse 8 says, Then he sent out a dove from him to see if the water was abated from the face of the land, but the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot. So she returned to him into the ark, for the water was on the surface of all the earth. Now, why do you think if the tops of some of the mountains were visible, why would the dove still come back and not find some place to stay?
Because there was no
Too far
food
away.
for it to eat.
No food, because a dove won't eat carrion.
Right.
And nothing had grown by that point.
Nothing had grown by that point, and unlike a crow, doves will not light on garbage or wet dirt. If it's mud, a dove won't get in it. A crow don't care, but a dove does. And so that would have told Noah that while he could see land off in the distance, it was not yet acceptable or safe for them to be on.
Is there a reason it's a she?
Um,
It seems,
simply because in Hebrew the word dove is a feminine noun.
gotcha.
He hadn't asked the pronoun.
Yeah.
Don't go there.
Alright. Sorry.
Now, is it possible that it was a female? It could have been, but it doesn't say. All we know is that the reason she is the pronoun that's used here is simply because dove is a feminine noun in Hebrew.
Gotcha.
Then he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark to himself. So he waited yet another 7 days, and again he sent out the dove from the ark. Notice he's waited 1 week, 40 days, now a week. The dove came to him toward evening, and behold, in her beak was a freshly picked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the water was abated from the earth. Now, olives, unlike a lot of other plants, olives are among the plants that can in fact grow in marshes and soggy ground. So the fact that she brings back an olive leaf tells you that stuff has started growing again. There's land out there, but the fact that it's an olive leaf tells him that it's probably still muddy. Verse 12 says, then he waited yet another 7 days and sent out the dove, but she did not return to him again. That would have told him there's now dry enough land, or kind of land that a dove is willing to nest in. Verse 13, now it came about in the 601st year. Again, notice how old was Noah when the flood started?
600.
600. So it says 601st year, on the first of the month, the water was dried up from the earth. Then Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the surface of the ground was dried up. Now, notice it doesn't say yet that the door of the ark had been opened, that he apparently had a spot where he was able to push the roof of the ark up, and probably a hatch or something of that sort that he could push back, get up and look out, and now he's able to see that there's dry ground around him. And in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Notice all until this point, Noah has taken it upon himself to check the condition of the earth. Notice God has been silent during all this. Noah's just checking the conditions, which apparently God didn't tell him he couldn't do. But Noah does not get off the ark until God tells him to. Verse 16, go out of the ark, you and your wife, and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Now, this is probably another reason that I'm sure God forced Noah to wait until there was plenty of dry land around, because if he had allowed the animals loose when it was still wet and muddy, most of these animals would have, if they'd have gotten bogged down, especially the smaller animals or the reptiles and snakes and things that crawled, they might not have survived. Also, if it's still too wet, you got a lot of these animals that would have stayed right there, and God wants them to disperse. Which, by the way, the fact that with the exception of the clean animals, how many are on here?
A lot.
2 of each.
2 of each. Yeah, that qualifies as a lot.
A lot.
2 of each. Which tells us, now there's an indication that before the flood, animal predation had already started. For example, when God confronted Cain after he his sacrifice was unacceptable. God told him, what about sin and its desire for Cain?
Stalking him.
Yeah, told him the sin's crouching at the door.
Yeah.
Now, unless animal predation had started by that point, the illustration would have been totally lost on Cain. He wouldn't have had a clue what God was talking about. What does it mean to crouch at the door? Unless he realized that, and seen animals stalking one another. So that indicates that in all probability, animal predation had started not long after the fall of humanity there in the Garden of Eden. However, here, what would have happened if any of those animals, with the exception maybe of the few clean ones that were on there, had predated on one another?
Extinction.
Yeah, immediate extinction of an entire species, or I should say probably an entire genus. So, in all probability, at least at this point, do you think God may have taken away from the animals the desire to predate on one another for at least a few generations? Otherwise, how are they going to reproduce? All right. Verse 18, so Noah went out, and his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by their families from the ark. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal, and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. By the way, verse 20. This is the first example we have anywhere in the Bible that there is now an altar being built. You'll notice before the flood, we're told there was worship of God. We can see examples of where sacrifice was being made. For example, where do you think that Adam and Eve got their animal skin clothing from? Probably God himself sacrificed it in showing them. Or God said, Adam, here's what you need to do. And walked him through the process. Somehow or other, God taught Adam how to make a sacrifice. So we know that sacrifices were done. And of course, that was the whole issue between Cain and Abel. Abel was sacrificing animals. So we know sacrifices were done. But we have no record anywhere up until this point that there was an altar built. However they were worshiping, it apparently was very informal. I mean, formal in the sense they were offering sacrifices, but we don't have any record of any place or an altar being built where there was some kind of formal worship going on. This is the first example of someone building an altar. Verse 21. And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. Now, verse 21 is important. We always talk about the fact that God promised that he would never again bring a flood upon the earth. But notice, who did God make the promise to?
Himself.
He made it to himself. God didn't promise us anything. He said he swore to himself that he wouldn't do it again. And notice the reason for it. It says the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. In other words, what God is saying is it doesn't matter what kind of punishment I bring upon the earth, the nature of sin that is within us is not going to change. So, in order for God to fulfill his covenant with Adam and Eve, that he would in fact send a Messiah, he cannot do this again, or can't destroy humanity from the face of the earth, or he breaks his promise, which we know God will not do. So God is basically saying, I'm never going to do this again because it won't matter what I do, humanity is going to be evil. They come from the very beginning already with the nature of sin within us. Now, verse 22 is another little interesting promise here, or should say prophecy maybe. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Now, anybody want to take a wild guess what the significance of that particular prophecy is?
Tucked away in this promise is a stipulation that is easy to miss. Day, night, and the seasons will continue, in quotations, while the earth remains.
There's two things there. Number one, that tells us that it was never God's intention for this earth to be permanent. That there would come a time when the earth as we know it will be done away with. So we see already there the statement back in Genesis that this earth is going to pass away. The second thing that we see is that even when Christ returns and he reigns for 1,000 years, the Bible tells us, we've already studied this, there's plenty of other prophecies that says that God is going to restore the earth back to its pre-flood condition. There's one thing that will not change. There's plenty of indication that with the firmament that was over the earth, that the earth was a worldwide paradise. However, notice here, this tells us that even in the millennial kingdom, summer and winter and cold and heat will continue. So if God does restore the firmament, it won't change the seasons. One of the things, and again, I don't know if there's anywhere, to my knowledge, there's nowhere in the Bible that specifically states this. This is just a theory on the part of some Christian astrophysicist. It is possible that before the flood, and of course, everybody knows that the earth is tilted, the earth does not rotate like this. It rotates like this. Anybody beside what's that?
27.5 degrees.
27.5 degrees. The earth is tilted.
That changes.
There are some people that believe that there's a possibility that before the flood, the earth had no tilt on its axis. And that may have been one of the reasons why that the earth was a worldwide paradise, because with a firmament that covered the entire planet, and there being no change, because if the earth has no tilt on its axis and it rotates like this, then it would be a 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night, no matter where you were on the earth, 365 days a year.
There'd be no seasons.
No seasons. It is believed, again, there's no biblical evidence of this. We're talking, astrophysicists and geologists that have studied the geological record and things of that sort, that believe that it may be possible that one of the things that caused the flood, that God may have actually caused the earth to tilt on its axis. Can you imagine that if the earth before the flood had no tilt on its axis, and then all of a sudden it was just forced, if the planet just did this, what would happen to the oceans?
Slosh around.
It'd be like sloshing around in a bathtub.
Yeah.
That water would have just come, a deluge of water all of a sudden. Well, guess what? That's exactly what happened. We had a deluge. And also, what would cause the earth to suddenly tilt like this? We were discussing this on Sunday, I think. Anybody know oh, by the way, did you know that the state of Florida has now proposed has a bill in before the state legislature, and DeSantis has said that he will sign it if it makes it through, officially in Florida, changing the name from the Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America. All right, well, by whatever name you call it, if you've ever looked at a map of the ocean floor in the Gulf of whatever it's called, you know what's under there?
Crater.
That's a crater. It is an absolutely humongous 1,000-mile wide crater. Imagine if an asteroid 1,000 miles or 1,500 miles across slammed through the atmosphere and struck the Earth. At least about three things would happen. Number one, something that big, what would it do to the planet itself?
Put it in an ice age.
Well, that's number three that I was going to, because the amount of dust and debris and moisture that would be thrown up into the atmosphere would bring on an ice age almost immediately.
Yeah.
Second, but to go back to the beginning, the first thing, would it be possible that something that huge striking the Earth would cause the planet to do this? That's number one. And the second thing is, when it suddenly struck, if that was in the middle of what was then the ocean, where'd all that water go?
On the land.
Uh-huh. And something striking the planet at that point,
Massive.
all of that underground water would suddenly do what?
Be released.
It would be released, which is exactly what the Bible says happened.
Massive earthquakes.
Massive earthquakes, massive flooding. Now, that's just what some, Christian geologists believe may have, because again, it's not explaining away what God did. We see all through this that God has chosen natural processes to bring about His will. And if God chose to do that, and God caused the earth suddenly to flip on its axis, that would then produce the seasons as we know it. Now, back to to verse 22. If that's what happened, God could still replenish this firmament that was up in the upper atmosphere as it was in the beginning. But if God doesn't fix the Earth's axis but leaves it tilted at 27.5 degrees, guess what? Even if there's a firmament up here,
You still got seasons.
we still got seasons. So, even in the millennial kingdom, that part of the earth will not be changed. God will leave the earth tilted on an axis so that we have continuing seasons during that 1,000-year period.
That would have destroyed all life on Earth anyway, something that large.
Well, yeah, pretty much that's what happened, except for those on the ark.
Yeah.
What happened to all the earth that became the hole off of Florida?
But what?
Became the hole. In other words, the mass that the meteorite made in the ground. What happened to all the earth? You got a hole, something's gotta come out of it.
Also, keep in mind that before the flood, Florida didn't exist. There was only one massive continent, and we don't know exactly where that continent would have been in relation to where the Gulf of Mexico is now. I mean, it could have been right there, or it could have been several thousand miles away. That we have no way of knowing.
I don't think, it's 23.5 degrees, not 27.
27, sorry.
Merrill!
Yeah, I thought it was 23, so I guess I
Sorry,
remember.
27.5 is where St. Petersburg is.
Oh, okay.
Ingrained in my head.
Latitude,
Yeah.
I just knew it was somewhere in that general vicinity. I wasn't going to argue over
To
it.
answer your question better, Mac, whatever ground was there when the asteroid hit would have been thrown out, just like like we see on the surface of the moon, ejecta. So it would have been piled up elsewhere. But as Castor was saying, this all happened to the continent that we call Pangaea, the original continent when everything was still together. The land hadn't been separated by God yet. So where that actually was on Pangaea, we don't know. But when God separated the land, that tectonic plate where that crater was moved to where it is now.
I was just using in my own judgment is that you go out west and see where there are craters made by
small.
small.
Mhm.
The what was in that hole is evenly distributed
Yeah.
around all.
But the
And it-
landmass has been changed so much since that happened that
Okay.
we wouldn't see evidence of that now.
Okay.
Also, keep in mind, and this would be consistent with the possibility that God used a massive asteroid to bring all this about. One of the things that we see is that wherever that landmass was, that as the water receded, mud and land and all that mess began to filter out and covered up what was the landmass before. If a massive meteor, well, of course, at this point it would be called a meteorite, struck the earth and all of that mess just did this, well, you're talking absolutely astronomical amounts of dirt and mud and crud that would have been thrown up into the atmosphere. And as it rained down, guess what? It would have hit that water that's now covering the earth. And as it, settled back down, guess what it would do to what had been the surface of the earth? And that's the reason today archaeologists, as they're, digging through, are finding fossils and things buried under massive amounts of dirt, because, well, guess where all that dirt came from? It would have settled out from all of that that had hit the water and just, filtered down. So all of what we're seeing today is consistent with the possibility that that's how God brought all this about. Now, again, all of that's theory. We don't know if God did it that way or not. What we do know is God brought a flood, and it was everywhere.
Yeah.
That much we know.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of it's theory.
Yeah.
Someday maybe what we're learning today, we can prove.
Mm-hmm.
Man has been trying thousands of years to prove one way or the other. If you're a scientist, you're looking at one way, you're a Christian, you're looking at the other. So you've had these two elements of education trying to prove their way. And it's the further we get down the road, the more we're finding out that Christianity is scoring Christianity.
There's a lot of what we're seeing today that archaeology and geology is, as they're learning more and more, are proving that everything that we're seeing in the surface of the earth and in the fossil record, all this stuff, is consistent with exactly what the Bible said.
Exactly.
The disagreement is, we look back, who said that?
Timeline.
Timeline. We look back and say, well, that happened about about 5,000 years or so ago. The evolutionists and the atheistic geologists say, oh, that happened millions of years ago.
Right.
No, it didn't. It was about 5,000 years ago.
Now, if you look at I believe, and it doesn't take that long, I don't think, like you said, timeline. But if you look at the maps of the world, and it can be twisted, and they can all fit together just the way it looks.
Oh yeah. And again, the only difference is that the atheistic geologists are saying, oh, well, it only moved an inch or two a year, and it took millions of years to
Maybe
spread
it
apart.
is right now.
Well, yeah,
Right
that's how
now,
fast it's moving
but-
now. But they make the assumption that because that's how fast it's moving now, that it must have always happened that way.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And we know that wasn't the case.
Right.
All right.
So- What was the timeline? I mean, biblically, it was 150 days from the time that the flood started
Until they got off.
until, was it just 150 days until they got off?
No.
Now, 150 days until the water began to recede. From start to finish, from the day it started raining until Noah stepped off the ark was just a little, I think was 370 days, I believe.
Just over a year.
Yeah, just a hair over a year.
I think part of it is it just, people in their mind hear it rained 40 days and 40 nights, and they don't think about the fact that it didn't just all of a sudden evaporate that day and the next morning we're all out on the ground.
Yeah.
It didn't,
And you figure even after the land, or I should say after the water was gone, it would have taken weeks. When you're considering how much water there was, it would have even taken weeks after that for the land to dry up enough that they could have stepped off